Welcome to lecture number 92, historical topic 8.9, the Great Society. There are two themes here, politics and power, and migration and settlement. To go along with the two themes, there are two learning objectives. The first learning objective is explain the causes and effects of continuing policy debates about the role of the federal government over time. In the Johnson administration, there were concerns about poverty and other social problems in America. Despite an overall affluence in post-war America, advocates raised concerns about the prevalence and persistence of poverty as a national problem. The Great Society were a set of domestic programs and policies introduced by President Johnson in the 1960s. They aimed to target, as the key concept suggests, poverty, but also racial injustice, education, and healthcare. The advocates who raised concerns did so through a couple of books that have been mentioned in over lectures. The Affluent Society in 1958 by John Kenneth Galbraith said that America was growing wealthy, but income disparity was also growing. It made the case for the government to maintain a large role in expanding the economy through public spending. Instead of spending on military expenditures after the war, it should spend more on social programs such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure. The Other America, published in 1962 by Michael Harrington, highlighted poverty in the United States. It estimated that 40 million Americans were living in poverty and that they were in need of some sort of assistance. It made the case that poverty was a systemic issue that could trap people in a downward cycle. It also criticized the U.S. government's inadequate response to the problem and inspired LBJ's War on Poverty. This is very reminiscent in its subject matter to a book that was covered in the previous period, How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis. Other problems that were highlighted by advocates concerned consumer safety. Unsafe at Any Speed by future Congressman Ralph Nader examined how the automobile industry had disregarded consumer safety in their designs of cars, prioritizing style, speed, and profit over safety. Nader singles out the Chevy Corvair as a prime example of the industry's flaws. Silent Spring by Rachel Carson highlighted environmental problems caused by the use of pesticides. She criticized the indiscriminate use of synthetic pesticides, particularly DDT. She pointed out that their use disrupted ecosystems when runoff would carry the chemicals to surrounding areas. It not only killed pests that infested crops, but also led to the decline of the bird population. The next key concept says, liberalism, based on anti-communism abroad and a firm belief in the efficacy of government power to achieve social goals at home, reached a high point of political influence by the mid-1960s. Liberalism, in the way in which the key concept outline uses it here, is the belief that government can provide a solution to societal problems. That there are some problems that are so large or rooted in large systems that only government has the resources necessary to tackle it. This takes root during the New Deal era, in which FDR used the federal government to try and solve the problems created by the Great Depression. President Johnson in the 1960s was trying to do the same thing because poverty persists in America. He declared a war on poverty. This was partly inspired by his experience as a teacher in Texas. Before he got involved in politics, he saw the impact of childhood poverty and the effect that had on people's lives. Johnson's version of liberalism also attempted to solve issues of inequality and discrimination. Finally, as the key concept suggests, it promoted anti-communism abroad. Johnson escalated the U.S. involvement in Vietnam to keep communist influence from taking over. The U.S. role in that war was more thoroughly covered in Lecture 91. Johnson's policies were generally popular with the American people, and in 1964, he easily defeated Barry Goldwater. However, Goldwater's brand of conservatism that wanted a smaller government inspired the future conservative movement that elected Ronald Reagan to the White House in 1980. The last key concept for this learning objective covers how liberalism was present in Johnson's Great Society programs. It says, liberal ideas found expression in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which attempted to use federal legislation and programs to end racial discrimination, eliminate poverty, and address the other social issues. The programs that attempted to end racial discrimination are covered in greater length in the next lecture, number 93. However, the two biggest pieces of legislation passed under the Johnson administration are the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The programs that are created to eliminate poverty include food stamps. Food stamps were given based on income eligibility and worked as a subsidy for the purchase of food and groceries. They used to come in the form of actual stamps that could be used and accepted as currency for the purchase of food at grocery stores. In the 21st century, the program has been updated and it looks more like a debit card. Medicare was a program that gave universal health care for those who were over the age of 65. The rationale for this adoption is similar to that of Social Security. Since seniors were less likely to work, they would also have less access to health insurance. The idea had initially been proposed during Harry Truman's administration, which is why Johnson invited the former president to the signing ceremony that's depicted on the screen. Medicaid was a similar program, but it gave healthcare access to those who lived in poverty. It tried to remove a large burdensome expense to those who were trying to escape it. The Child Nutrition Act, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, worked under the assumption that increasing funding to schools that served disadvantaged students would increase the prospects for the students that attended those schools. Johnson's programs also attempted to solve other social issues, some associated with infrastructure. He created the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Housing was an issue that cut into socioeconomic and racial inequalities. If the government could assist in securing housing for various groups, then they could erase the inequality. The National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act created a regulatory agency to oversee the automobile industry for the problems that Ralph Nader uncovered, and the use of synthetic pesticide DDT was banned due to the attention Rachel Carson brought to it. The Great Society programs were plentiful, and they had the effect of increasing the size and the role of the federal government, very much like the New Deal before it. The second learning objective is explain the continuities and changes in immigration patterns over time. The key concept of this learning objective covers the impact of the Immigration Act of 1965. The key concept says, immigrants from around the world sought access to the political, social, and economic opportunities in the United States, especially after the passage of the new immigration law in 1965. The Immigration Act of 1965 replaced the National Origins Act of 1924. That act limited Eastern Hemisphere immigration to the United States. It created a quota of 2% of what their 1890 immigration numbers used to be. The other act that it replaced was the 1917 Immigration Act that not only implemented a literacy test, but had created a barred zone for immigration which covered most of Asia. These two acts together had a noticeable impact in immigration to the US. It lowered the percentage of the foreign-born population from over 20% to just over 5% in 40 years. Western Hemisphere immigration had not been bound to those same restrictions. Though the 1965 Act removes the restrictions on previously affected regions, it creates a new set of guidelines for immigration that will be the same for every country's migrants. Now every country, including countries in the Western Hemisphere, would get a yearly 20,000 immigrant cap, and a total cap of 290,000 migrants. This excludes family reunification. If a U.S. citizen had family abroad, they were able to bring those people over, and the migration through the family reunification would not count against the country's 20,000 person cap, or the 290,000 total cap. This did two things. One, it led to a huge increase in immigration in the United States. The percentage of foreign-born population rises again to just over 15% over the next 40 years. The act has economic impacts too. These immigrants that came over started to work, and the percentage of foreign-born people in the labor force goes up nearly back to what it was before the quotas. The second major thing that the 1965 Act did was that it created the problem of illegal immigration. Western Hemisphere countries had not been subject to a cap in the past, so Latin American immigrants from Mexico and Central America used to go to the United States to work for several months and then take the money that they earned to go back to their home countries. It was a seasonal migration that met the labor needs of the U.S. and financial needs of the migrants. This type of migrants are often referred to as birds of passage, comparing them to the seasonal migratory patterns of birds. However, after the 1965 Act, it takes a lot more effort to get into the United States, and it may be a lot more difficult to get back in the future. So immigrants that normally would have gone and come back into their home countries were now staying in the United States as countries filled their caps. Immigrants from Latin America began to avoid official entry points so that they weren't turned away. The legality or illegality of their crossing into the United States becomes an unintended problem of the Act. Alright, finally here is the recap. The United States experienced fundamental economic problems of poverty and inequality despite economic growth. Johnson employed the federal government to address issues through the Great Society agenda. His reforms were meant to target economic, social, and racial issues. And finally, the Immigration Act reforms the old discriminatory system, but creates a new, unique problem through the new system.
Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back in the next lecture.